B. Collins.
Peter B. Collins, news and comment. It's Monday, November 25th, 2019. Everybody's got a short work week this week as we gear up for the Thanksgiving break. And I may do some Black Friday shopping online, but you will not catch me in any retail location on Friday. So Mike Bloomberg has made it official. The former Republican mayor of New York, a billionaire founder of the Bloomberg News Network, has decided to run for president as a Democrat. He has hinted he's willing to spend up to $500 million of his alleged $51 billion fortune to try to buy the office. And I find this offensive. Not only the money involved, but the arrogance that America needs to see a face-off of two New York billionaires to determine which one will be the next serial dictator of the United States. And to be fair, Bloomberg has authoritarian instincts. Just look at Stop-n-frisk. He's apologized for it, but hey, he conducted that policy for most of the 12 years that he was mayor of New York. And remember that he had the city charter changed so he could serve a third term. And I do agree with Mike Bloomberg that sugary beverages and sugar intake, including that high fructose corn syrup that is infiltrated in almost every commercial food product, they pose a danger to Americans. But he used an authoritarian, a strong-arm approach, telling New Yorkers, here's my imposed limit on how much soda you can buy in one cup. And, put aside that you can buy 2 big gulps if you want to, right? And instead of using taxes on sugary beverages, as many communities have, a billionaire free trader like Mike Bloomberg would never consider that. So I see this as a really bad bet. And it's probably a wager with up to $500 million on the table. Now, Bloomberg has announced that because he's so wealthy, he won't take a salary if he's elected president, and he is not accepting any contributions to his political campaign. Now, he will avoid the embarrassment that San Francisco billionaire Tom Steyer had to endure, saying, yeah, I'm rich enough to fund my own campaign, but send me $1 so I can get on the Democratic debate stage. How's Bloomy going to handle that? Maybe he'll just buy television time and stage his own debates. I really don't know. His strategy is not clear, but he's already put down $30 million for a massive national ad buy in 100 media markets. Nobody's ever done this before. So he's going to be polluting your social media. If you watch television, a lot of people don't anymore, but if you watch TV programs, his commercials will pop up all day long. And it's a biographical 1-minute spot where he's trying to tell you that he's the man who can rescue America. First, he must rescue the Democrats from Joe Biden and those dangerous lefties. And keep in mind that while Mike Bloomberg has some hair left and probably colors it, he is 77 years old. That makes him older than Trump, older than Warren, and just a year shy of Bernie Sanders. So this is the year of older white candidates, mostly male except for Liz? That seems strange to me. But what I see as the benefit here, and this is it's a very fluid situation. I don't pretend to know how this is going to play out. But it appears to me that the biggest hurt is going to be visited on Joe Biden. That Bloomberg is likely to use his money to attack and undermine the former vice president. And he's got a rich treasure trove of self-produced dirt to use on Joe Biden. He don't even need to go to Ukraine, friends. Now get this, Bloomberg made his money on the eponymous news service. And here in San Francisco, Bloomberg buys the entire day, 24 hours, on a radio station owned by the company used to be known as Clear Channel. It's now iHeartMedia. So to my knowledge, Bloomberg doesn't own any media outlets, but they pay to get their programs on the air in different markets. And frankly, I don't know how many cities have a Bloomberg radio station. And he runs an international, a global news service. And his top editor sent a memo around. This guy's name is John Micklethwaite. And he said that for the duration, that the Bloomberg News Service will not investigate their boss or any of his Democratic rivals. Now, they're going to do kind of passive reporting, stenography, on the campaigns. And they've said that, well, you know, like if the New York Times does a big investigation into Bloomberg, we might cover that. And former politics news director at Bloomberg, Kathy Kiley, resigned back in 2016 because she didn't think she could do her job without covering Mike aggressively. And she said the new rules relegate his political writers to stenography journalism. It's not satisfying for journalists or for readers. I think people will go elsewhere for in-depth political coverage. Megan Murphy, a former editor of Bloomberg Businessweek, tweeted, "It is truly staggering that any editor would put their name on a memo that bars an army of unbelievably talented reporters and editors from covering massive, crucial aspects of one of the defining elections of our time. Staggering." So Bloomberg, should revert to the pre-Trump policy of either selling his assets or putting them in a blind trust. But assuming he holds the bulk of the Bloomberg shares, that is a pretty major undertaking. I want to recommend, and I have linked to this article in the show file for today's podcast at peterbcollins.com. Mehdi Hasan at The Intercept opens his critique of Mike Bloomberg's foreign policy by lifting a line from Elizabeth Warren. She used it on Joe Biden. And he says Bloomberg is running in the wrong presidential primary. And when you look at Bloomberg's record, Hassan says he is so right-wing he makes Biden sound like Bernie. Much has been made of Bloomberg's blind defense of Wall Street, including his astonishing claim that it was Congress, not the banks, that created the mortgage crisis in 2008, his ridiculous comparison of Warren's modest wealth tax to Venezuela, his cynically timed apology for presiding over unconstitutional stop-and-frisk practices in New York, and his shameful failure to apologize to the city's Muslim residents for subjecting them to an Orwellian surveillance regime. As mayor of New York and a Republican back in 2003, he not only backed the illegal invasion of Iraq, he also supported perhaps the most dishonest and bizarre justification that Saddam Hussein was involved in the 9/11 attacks. And get this, speaking of 9/11, I heard Rush Limbaugh for a few minutes earlier today, and he was attacking the CIA related to everything that's happened since Trump was installed as president. And he used the false information of the CIA that led us into the Iraq war. And the hypocrisy was just stinking up my car. Because Rush Limbaugh was one of the biggest boosters of George W. Bush and the war in Iraq. And he's rewritten his own history in order to make the comment he did today. So Hassan says, then there is the Israel-Palestine conflict. Bloomberg is a long-standing supporter of Israel, and especially Netanyahu, who he has called a friend, wished him well on his birthday. During both the 2009 and 2014 Israeli assaults on Gaza, Bloomberg flew to Israel to express his solidarity with Tel Aviv. Quote, Israel is doing the right thing in defending itself, he said in 2009, and in 2014, Israel was entirely justified in attacking Gaza, he said. He's also a big booster of Mohammed bin Salman, the guy with the bone. Well, he has people with bone saws. He doesn't have his own, right? But Bloomberg helped launder the reputation in March 2018 when he hosted the reckless autocrat in New York and posed for pictures at Starbucks. And just 2 months ago, the former mayor sat down for an interview with a Saudi newspaper and heaped praise on the economic and social reforms introduced by the Crown Prince. So that's a quick look at Mike Bloomberg and how he fits into the Democratic Party, how he fits into defeating Trump. He is so similar to Trump. And fundamentally, his authoritarian instincts are what repel me from Mike Bloomberg. Now, while we're offering critiques of foreign policy, Elizabeth Warren is the target of Nathan Robinson in an op-ed today at The Guardian. And he writes about her history. She spent much of her career as a Republican. She worked at Harvard Law, training generations of elite corporate lawyers, did legal work for big corporations accused of wrongdoing, collected donations from billionaires, held secret meetings with investment bankers, applauded when Trump vowed that America would never become a socialist country. And he says, lately, Warren has finally begun to make her true feelings clear, and progressives no longer need to wonder whether she's with us or not. She's not, he says. Warren released a Medicare for All plan that called it a long-term plan, which left-wing political analyst Ben Studebaker pointed out is code to rich people for this is just all pretend. Now, I'm not so sure about that, but I don't think she's totally pretending. But she has dialed back her commitment to Medicare for All, and that is a fair item to report. Then when we get to foreign policy, instead of condemning an obvious right-wing coup in Bolivia, as Sanders did, and denouncing the seizure of power by Christian theocrats, Warren gave a tepid statement that recognized legitimacy of the country's new interim leadership. On Venezuela, Warren's statements were even worse. She told Pod Save America, and we've reported this, that the U.S. should recognize Juan Guaido, the leader of the opposition who has no legitimate claim to the presidency. And Robinson writes, this is not trivial. Foreign policy is one of the most important parts of a president's role. And speaking of Venezuela, Nick Kristof, who is a man who cares about people. He has written movingly about repressed and poverty-stricken people all over the world, and I respect his compassion. But in his Sunday column, he mixed compassion with the U.S. demonizing talking points of Nicolas Maduro, even as he raised the critical question. Headline reads, Venezuelan kids are dying. Are we to blame? So, don't get whiplash here, but let me just read the first two paragraphs to start. Dateline Caracas. This country is a kleptocracy ruled incompetently by thugs who are turning a prosperous oil-exporting nation into a failed state sliding toward starvation. A young mom named Daniela Serrano weeps for her baby girl, and I can't help wondering if American economic sanctions also bear some responsibility. So, he feels compelled to recite the bipartisan talking points, Maduro bad, socialism evil, even as he examines the obvious question. Are Venezuelans suffering and dying because of American sanctions as we try to externally change their government? So he writes, the hard question for Americans, do our sanctions intended to undermine the regime actually make it more likely that babies will die? Next paragraph. Again, the whiplash. Maduro's brutal socialist government is primarily responsible for the suffering, but there is evidence that sanctions imposed by Obama and Trump are adding to the economy's deterioration and the torment of ordinary Venezuelans. So he has a heart. He's asking the right questions, but it's intermingled with this bullshit of American exceptionalism and our right to dictate to sovereign nations who their leaders should be. Today we are learning that U.S. troops have resumed large-scale counterterrorism actions against the Islamic State in northern Syria. Now, here's some more whiplash. I actually applauded when Trump said he was going to pull all our troops out of Syria, and that, of course, led to the hand-wringing over the Kurds and all of this blowback that was mostly driven by anti-Trumpism. On Friday, American soldiers, hundreds of Syrian Kurdish fighters, remember them, the ones we abandoned? Reunited to conduct what the Pentagon said was a large-scale mission to kill and capture Islamic State fighters about 120 miles south of the Turkish border. Separately, several hundred other troops, some with Bradley fighting vehicles, arrived from Iraq and Kuwait under a subsequent order from Trump to protect Syria's eastern oil fields. Yeah, get the oil, Trump. And the leader of this operation, General Kenneth McKenzie, Central Command, said he would have about 500 troops operating in that area over the next few weeks. What we're talking about are the pockets of people who represent the wreckage that followed in the wake of the caliphate. They still have the power to injure, still have the power to cause violence. Who are you kidding that 500 troops can turn the tide? In a country we have no authorization to put our boots on the ground in. General McKenzie said the relations with the Kurds are now pretty good, and that American troops will stay in northern Syria indefinitely. We don't have an end date. And twice in the last 10 months, Trump tried to order our troops out, and they wouldn't let him. It is sad. And in some ways, in a dark and black humor way, it is comical. And buried in Sunday's New York Times is an admission that we now have an additional 14,000 American troops since spring deployed to the Persian Gulf. Now, I heard about the 3,000 that we sent to Saudi Arabia after their oil facilities were attacked. Yemen claimed responsibility, but nobody accepts that in the decision-making arenas. That's all Iran. So we're gearing up for military conflict with Iran. But America is, of course, distracted by impeachment and what we're going to talk about at the Thanksgiving dinner table. More than 60 international doctors have signed a letter saying that Julian Assange may not survive until February, which is when his extradition hearings begin in Britain. They say that he should be transferred from the high-security Belmarsh prison to a university teaching hospital to receive expert medical assessment. Were such urgent assessment and treatment not to take place, we have real concerns on the evidence currently available that Assange could die in prison. The medical situation is urgent. There is no time to lose. What we've seen, says Niles Melzer, the UN Special Rapporteur on Torture, is outright contempt for Assange's rights and integrity. Despite the medical urgency of my appeal, which was issued in October, and the seriousness of the violations, the UK has not undertaken any measures of investigation, prevention, and redress required by international law. And the New York Times, I'm reading from here, misstates the current status of Assange. It says he is serving a 50-week prison sentence. He has completed the bail-jumping prison sentence. And he is simply being held to be ready for what is supposed to be the February start of the extradition hearings. And there's a great recap and defense of Julian Assange at Consortium News today. I think it also appears at Common Dreams under the byline of Nozomi Hayase, who has written a biography of Julian Assange. And she correctly notes, I made this point last week, that the New York Times has recently published a blockbuster story exposing the Chinese government's coordinated crackdown on ethnic minorities, and they used 400 pages of leaked documents to drive that reporting. And she notes, while the Times applauds leaks that were reportedly made by an anonymous member of the Chinese political establishment, when it comes to the wrongdoing of their own government, rarely do they show the same exuberance and courage in publishing the information. And I would add that they hypocritically used WikiLeaks information, and now they think there's nothing valuable left at WikiLeaks, so they can dispose of Julian Assange. He is now inconvenient to corporate media requirements. And I do commend the author here for noting that Chelsea Manning remains in jail on a contempt of court charge for refusing to testify to the WikiLeaks grand jury, which appears to have completed its work. It is gratuitous. It is completely undefensible, indefensible. And yet we hear not a single progressive recently making a case or even offering compassion to Chelsea Manning. And to the idea that WikiLeaks is in the past tense, well, I want to commend Caitlin Johnstone, the Australian writer, who has stayed on the case of the alleged use of chemical weapons in Douma, Syria in April of 2018. And now she has gotten a hold, via WikiLeaks, of an important internal email at the Organization for Prohibition of Chemical Weapons. And one of the inspectors who was sent to Douma wrote a point-by-point critique of both an interim and final report from OPCW that falsely claims that chemical agents were used. And I'll link to Johnstone's piece. I encourage you to read it. But what it clearly shows is that the unnamed investigator wrote to the top dog at OPCW, whose name is Bob Fairweather, accusing leadership of misleading the public with information that it omitted from the report. And let me just quote a couple of items here from the letter, Dear Bob. He says, as a member of the fact-finding mission team that conducted the investigation in Douma, April 2018, my gravest concern at the redacted version of the report. After reading this modified report, I was struck by how much it misrepresents the facts. Many of the facts and observations outlined in the full version are inextricably interconnected, and by selectively omitting certain ones, an unintended bias has been introduced into the report. For example, in the final conclusions, quote, the team has sufficient evidence at this time to determine that chlorine was likely released from cylinders. He says this is highly misleading, not supported by the facts, and that the amount of chlorine found, which is described as high levels in the OPCW report, these levels were so low that they were essentially trace quantities, 1 to 2 parts per billion. If a chemical weapon had been used, those levels would have been substantially higher. So, Johnstone commends Moon of Alabama, the online commentary site that has surfaced a lot of important information over the recent years, and everyone else, including Aaron Mate, the folks at Consortium News, and yours truly, who were skeptical of these claims. Every day I pause for a second to thank the people who support my work here at the Peter B. Collins Podcast with your subscriptions. And holy cow, we've got some new subscribers. Michael Meadows just took out a new annual subscription. Nice going. Robert Hoff and his wife, the author, M. Pearl, or is it Pearl M? I'm sorry, I don't have it in front of me. Forgive me. But they took out a $10 a month subscription over the weekend. And here is, there's one other new one here. Well, it's not on my front page. So I want to thank them, plus Marvin Rasmussen, who's an ongoing $5 a month contributor, and also Paul Karsh. You can do it too. Just visit peterbcollins.com, click on the menu tab. When you pull it down, click on Become a Subscriber, and in no time, you can set up $5, $10, $20 a month, or $50 annual that suits your particular budget. Well, I identify some leak-based and yellow journalism in the New York Times on Saturday. On Friday, I reported that there are rumors that the Justice Department Inspector General is ready to release his report. That's Michael Horowitz, and it is due to be made public on December 9th. But the New York Times can't wait. And in the article, they name no one as a source. They acknowledge twice that they have not seen the draft report that they are writing a major story on. This is yellow journalism. And it appears to be intended to inoculate the public and skeptics of Russiagate, like me, saying that, here, let me quote. The People said, they caution the report is not complete. The New York Times has not reviewed the draft, which could contain other significant findings. This is really inappropriate. And, as I said, it mainly appears to be aimed at exonerating claims that top FBI officials, led by James Comey, behaved either illegally or inappropriately in launching the 2016 investigation into Trump Russia. And I will await the report. I am intrigued. It does refer for criminal proceedings Kevin Kleinsmith, a low-level lawyer in the FBI, who, they say, made changes to a document by adding information from another agency. When another agency is used, that's most likely the CIA. And then that modified document was submitted to the FISA court for a renewal of the Carter Page surveillance warrant. Now, we're being told that, this doesn't show that the Steele dossier was used to drive the original investigation of Trump Russia. But I want to take a second pass at a story that I reported on Friday and was published in the Saturday New York Times. They used the testimony of Fiona Hill, who said Russiagate's true, Ukrainegate is not. And Rachel Maddow just went to town on Friday night as she basically tightened nooses around the necks of every Republican, saying that their denial of Russiagate, their defense of Trump, is furthering a Russian plot. She makes them all out to be tools of Russia. Now, I think a lot of Republicans are idiots, especially those who are 100% loyal to Trump. But this is really dangerous. It locks in the unproven and what I consider to be exaggerated elements of the Mueller limited hangout investigation report, and it expands the propaganda narrative that originated with the Hillary Clinton campaign, was picked up by sympathetic media like MSNBC, and many people have been persuaded that it's all true. And get this, in the Sunday Times, they gave space to Glenn Simpson and Peter Fritsch, the co-founders of Fusion GPS, so they could selectively deny things that are out there and openly questioned by the public. They make these selective claims like, hey, Fusion GPS commissioned the reports by Christopher Steele, and we're willing to clear up some of the nonsense so abundant on the right. Well, they don't mention that it was Hillary Clinton's campaign laundering money through a Washington law firm that actually hired Fusion GPS, and they in turn paid Christopher Steele. And they tell the story that when they were both reporters for the Wall Street Journal, they investigated Paul Manafort and his role in Ukraine. And after they left the Journal, they returned their focus to Manafort in early 2016. We found a 19-page legal filing in a federal courthouse in Virginia related to Oleg Deripaska, who accused Manafort of making off with tens of millions of dollars of his money. And then they say they stumbled on some Ukrainian media reports noting that documents existed in Kiev that chronicled the political spending of the pro-Russia ruling party that Manafort worked for. They claim that they did not have the black ledger, and they take no credit for it. And so it's really bizarre because it's not an edited document, it's an opinion piece, and it raises more questions, in my view, than it answers. Now, fresh reporting today from the New York Times, published online, and they do cite sources for this. They interviewed two Ukrainian oligarchs, Dmitry Firtash and Ihor Kolomoisky. And they say that they develop a narrative here that Rudy Giuliani used inducements and threats to try to get them to dig for dirt on Joe Biden and his son in Ukraine. Firtash, who is wanted on an extradition warrant to the United States, was asking for access, favorable access to the Justice Department to try to plead his case. And we learn that two lawyers that were hired by Firtash at the suggestion of Giuliani, that is, of course, Victoria Tonsing and Joseph DeGeneva, they are Trumpers who have written op-eds in his defense, and they are questionable people, I'll put it that way. But they got an appointment with Attorney General Bill Barr for Dmitry Firtash. And these deals involve Lev Parnas and all those wonderful people who are cronies of Giuliani's. And what it points up to me is that he's at the center of this case. The Democrats appear ready to write their report. They think they've got enough on Trump to proceed to articles of impeachment. They haven't talked to Don McGahn. The lawsuit about whether or not he can testify before the impeachment inquiry may see a ruling. It may have already happened today. It was expected today by a federal district court. And now Mike Pompeo is being more deeply implicated into this scheme. And they are a bunch of racketeers. I mean, this shakedown of Ukraine is something I take seriously. As I've pointed out, I don't think it's the best route to impeachment. And I hope the Democrats will add back the obstruction of justice. If they can get Don McGahn and Rudy Giuliani to testify, I think that actually could change the minds of some Republicans who are holding out today. We shall see. So I mentioned that I've got the note here that Don McGahn's ruling may come out later today. Trump is saying he still has confidence in Mick Mulvaney. Well, I don't know why he ever did, but there is new information surfacing from emails that were accessed under FOIA that show that Mulvaney and White House budget officials were trying to figure out how long they could withhold the funds from Ukraine and what the legal underpinnings of that are. Also, 8 Republican lawmakers are being targeted with mobile billboards by Move On and Need to Impeach. That's Tom Steyer's funded group. They're targeting Congresspeople Mark Amodei, Nevada, Brian Fitzpatrick, Pennsylvania, Scott Perry, Pennsylvania, Chip Roy in Texas, Francis Rooney in Florida, David Schweikert in Arizona, and Elise Stefanik in New York. They're also going after Will Hurd, and that's kind of pointless. He's announced he's not running for re-election. Lindsey Graham is getting ready to set up his own investigation of Hunter Biden's business activities in Ukraine. And as you know, I think they deserve investigation, and Lindsey Graham has no credibility to conduct such an inquiry. So I mentioned earlier the leaks of China's documents that show the scope of the repression, the essential concentration camps, re-education camps for the Muslim minority Uyghurs from the far western Xinjiang province of China. And the United Kingdom, along with the European Union, have urged China to give the UN observers immediate and unfettered access to these detention camps where more than 1 million people are reported to be held without trial. This is in response to the leaked China cables that came from within the Communist Party in recent weeks. The European Commission condemned the use of political re-education camps. We have consistently spoken out against the existence of political re-education camps, widespread surveillance, and restrictions of freedom of religion or belief against Uyghurs and other minorities in Xinjiang. We as the European Union continue to expect China to uphold its international obligations and to respect human rights. Meanwhile, the local elections in Hong Kong, which aren't that meaningful because the legislature in Hong Kong doesn't have any real power, it's notable because there was a big sweep by pro-democracy candidates who won a majority in the vote for 452 seats. So it is a strong message that the population supports pro-democracy action. 71% turnout of 4.1 million registered voters. Previous historic high was 47%. So people are engaged. But Beijing continues to issue threats. And Carrie Lam, the Beijing-appointed leader of Hong Kong, so far is holding firm. Then there is the case of a Chinese spy whose name is Wang Liqiang, Liqiang. He has applied for asylum in Australia with a 17-page plea where he details code names of covert operations, shadowy business ventures, and discloses that he personally was deployed to Taiwan and donated $2+ million to a candidate opposed to the pro-democracy candidate there. And Beijing says, kind of Trump-like, we don't know this guy. China denied the claim, saying this guy, Liqiang, is a convicted fraudster wanted by Shanghai police. On Friday, I didn't do a very good job of reporting on the sentencing of American former CIA officer Jerry Chun-Shing Lee. And I want to thank the gentle commentary from our friend George Maschke, who listens from the Netherlands, where he lives in Den Haag. He said, I followed this case closely. This never went to trial, and that's what was not apparent from the Washington Post story that I was using to base my coverage from on Friday. But the New York Times is very clear. In the second paragraph, Jerry Chun-Shing Lee pleaded guilty in May to conspiring with Chinese intelligence agents. What the Washington Post article had noted was that they never found any evidence that he actually delivered secret content to China. They showed that he had money and that he had acknowledged that he had been asked, but they never really proved that he followed through. Trump has made things worse, continuing to meddle in the military justice system, and it led to the forced resignation of the Navy Secretary over the weekend. And there's this weird backstory that the Secretary of Defense, former Raytheon lobbyist Mark Esper, says that his Navy Secretary tried to make a secret deal with the White House related to the case of Gallagher, Chief Petty Officer Edward Gallagher. And as you know, he was court-martialed, and at the last minute, one of his colleagues took the rap for murder in a war zone. And Gallagher was turned in by his own colleagues in the Navy SEALs for his excessive, dangerous criminal activity. And Trump defending the alleged war crimes that Gallagher was acquitted of is so low and sordid. Makes me want to reach for a little Lysol spray. Finally, today, Pope Francis distinguished himself on a papal visit to Japan. He went to Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and he gave speeches. The use of atomic energy for purposes of war is immoral, as is the possession of atomic weapons. We will be judged for this, he said. Nice going, Frank. Thanks for listening to my daily news and comment podcast. You can share it all over the place. You'll find it on YouTube. I remain Peter B. Collins.
Happy trails to you until we meet again. Happy trails.